Hello and welcome back to ATA Live. ATA standing for the Australian Taxpayers Alliance. They're the mob that help us to put this on and allow us to come back and chat to you every week. I am one half of your hosting duo, John Humphreys, and I'm joined as always. I guess it's not quite as always, but it's as mostly. Gene Tunny. How you doing, Gene?
Good, thanks, John. How are you, mate?
Top of the world. Another beautiful day in paradise. Although
Excellent.
If there's anyone out there that would like to buy a house, I could take a lot of stress off my shoulders by buying my house, but that's a topic for another day.
Yes,
I guess we're here mostly to talk about the economic in general, not the specific situation of the Humphreys family household economy. So
John, are we going to segue into you got a natural segue there from your issue to the first topic of conversation, haven't you?
There is, and yet I still feel the need to go back and do the little introductory blurb, which I should have brought this up at a different time. So I guess that proves one of the things that I normally say at this point, which is that this is live. So you see whatever mistakes or brilliant insights we have, you catch them live. There's no hiding from you, our dear audience. This is being simulcast to YouTube, Facebook, and X. So wherever you are on those three platforms, please stop, pause what you're doing, pause. Wait, I can see you. I can't see you. Please stop, share, like this video if you can, and share it, get it flowing around the algorithms. It helps us to reach people and have a bigger and better conversation. Also, this is a live chat. Feel free to put your comments in as we're going. Comments, questions, criticisms, anything starting with a K sound. And we'll put some of them up if we have time. We can't promise anything, but I think we've shown, like last week, we're quite willing to get distracted following the questions. And indeed, one of our topics for today is directly inspired by a question from last week. So we're going to come back and address that issue of a Tobin tax at some stage today. But now, having got all those preliminaries out of the way, go back and see if I can rediscover that segue, Gene, that you mentioned, which I suspect the segue you're going for is houses, buying a house. What a lot of people care about is the interest rates. And of course...
Yeah. Well, the RBA didn't do you any favours, did they, John? I mean, with their decision not to cut the cash rate on Tuesday, it would have helped you potentially if they would have cut the cash rate. That would have made borrowing a little bit cheaper for potential buyers of your house. So that would have been the segue I'd suggest.
Yes, no, that's quite right as well. No, I was a little conflicted because I am a bit of a monetary hawk by nature.
Yes.
I do worry about inflation more than perhaps some of our other macroeconomic commentators out there who want interest rate cuts at every opportunity. So I am predisposed towards having a hawkish RBA position, sometimes out of step with mainstream economic opinion because of that. And yet my own personal situation, yes, you're very right. I would have really appreciated a cut this month. But anyway, we're here to comment on the Australian economy, not the Humphreys family economy. So I'm of the opinion that, look, I think it was a 50-50 call, but I think being biased towards a little bit of risk aversion on inflation isn't a bad thing at this point, given how much uncertainty we have overseas. What's your take?
Yeah, look, I agree with you there. I think that is their main job, really, to be concerned about inflation. Inflation, we know, is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, and the Reserve Bank has responsibility for monetary policy. That's the main instrument we use to target inflation. So I think, look, it's fair enough if they're concerned that the inflation, it's not obvious yet that trimmed mean inflation, that core inflation measure, which strips out, all of the volatile items, they're not convinced yet that that's fully anchored within that 2 to 3% target band. And what surprised people, I think, is that the monthly inflation data, the trimmed mean, which is that core inflation measure, that came in at around 2.4, I think, through the year. But the quarterly figure from the March quarter was still around, was 2.9. So it was just within the target band. And essentially what the RBA decision on Tuesday has proven is that the RBA doesn't trust the monthly inflation numbers because they still only cover, I think, 60% or something of all of the goods and services in the economy. So it's not the full CPI that the RBA is going to be that is really concerned about. So I think that's what's going on, and they're also concerned about unemployment is still very low by historical standards. Okay, so 4.1%. Or just a bit over 4%. And that means that it's probably, like, it may well be below what they call the natural rate of unemployment, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. So it's possible that they're concerned about that low unemployment rate contributing to wage pressure and then contributing to inflation. So, look, I agree with you. I tend to be a bit of an inflation hawk, but this has been a very controversial decision given the GDP numbers don't look strong. We had very weak GDP growth. We've had negative GDP per capita growth, as you and I have been talking about. So, look, I can understand why there is a lot of dissent over this decision and a lot of debate. And what I wanted to talk about tonight is that what this decision has brought up is this whole debate about RBA independence. Should we have an independent central bank? I say yes, but we've got some very influential voices now saying, look, we should revisit this. And I think it is now, a legitimate subject of debate, and it's something we should be thinking about.
Yeah, a couple of just segues or stepping off points from what you said there, just to throw this out into the mix. So I think they've taken a defensible position if you're aiming for that 2 to 3% bracket, because things do jump around. So like you were saying, they might be waiting and just get the complete data. I'd add the extra thing from my perspective. I disagree with the 2 to 3% goal. I'd prefer to see a lower goal anyway. So if we're having 2.9%, you say, oh yes, it's within the brackets, but it might go back above 3. You could make that case very legitimately for keeping the rates on hold. I would prefer the goal to be less than 2% inflation anyway. So that's another thing that motivates my hawkishness. The other thing is, if you've got a 2 to 3% goal, then the idea is you don't change rates if inflation is between 2 to 3%. Inflation is between 2 to 3%, right? The theory would be, this is not my preferred because I don't have the 2 to 3% goal, but the theory would be you cut rates when inflation is below 2%, you increase rates when inflation is above 3%, and you stay steady when it's between 2 and 3. And unless I'm missing something here, the data suggests between 2 and 3. So,
well, John, I can explain what I think you're missing. Aren't you missing that if it's at 2 to 3%, they should be going back to what they think is the natural rate of interest, or in
There's
real
no
terms, the R star. Well, they think there is, right? So they think so. And people in the markets are thinking what they're trying to do is to get the interest rate or the cash rate back to the neutral interest rate, which, depending on what estimate you believe, is going to be somewhere between maybe 3.25%, given that it's the bank view. From I understand this from Michael Knox, is that the R star, the real rate of it, the real short run interest rate, the cash rate, is either 0.5% or 0.75%, and then you add 2.5% for the inflation target onto that, and that's your neutral cash rate. So that's what the bank is going to get back to. Now, why they don't just cut it all the way there, if they think that inflation is in the target band to contain, then you think, well, why don't they just cut it straight away to 3.25% or 3%? No, what they do is they do it in increments because they think there's value in doing that, because they recognise all of the uncertainty. So they always do it in little steps.
Yeah, I got to say, I think that's just a wrong-headed way of thinking about what the neutral, quote-unquote, interest rate is. Interest rate is a price. It's a price on loanable funds. And the only method that the Reserve Bank has, in my opinion, to actually close in on what that, and prices can change. They can change naturally depending on the supply and demand of loanable funds. And the only way the Reserve Bank has to close in on what that sort of price clearing interest rate should be is it should be whatever price, i.e., whatever interest rate gets inflation right. Right. So this is the inflation targeting is the way to target the correct price. So once you have inflation at what you want it to be, by definition, the interest rate you have to achieve that is the correct interest rate. Now, again, I repeat that 2 to 3% inflation goal isn't my goal, right? I'd prefer a 0 to 1% inflation goal. But putting that aside, if put aside the debate of what the inflation goal should be, if the goal is 2.5%, whatever interest rate is getting you 2.5% is the market clearing price for loanable funds or the interest rate. So that would be my argument on that. I think that's how inflation targeting works as a concept. It's why inflation targeting sort of won the day in the 1980s in that big sort of monetarist economic debate. Saying how can you work out the correct amount of money to put out, you put out the amount of money that into the economy, that's the new M0 or the new M1 or M3, you put out the amount that leads to the inflation that is sort of stable and the level you want. But maybe we're getting a bit...
but let me just steelman the RBA's position here, okay? This is how I think they're thinking, right? So I agree with you, right? If you've got inflation contained and you've got the interest rate at a particular level, then yes, I mean, it does suggest, okay, that's the right interest rate. But then what about the dynamic effects? Okay, so the lags. So the RBA is thinking, well, monetary policy has, it acts on the economy with a lag. So after, it's continuing to impact after a few quarters, or it could even take longer than that. So what happens if you've got your interest rate above the neutral interest rate? Then you could drive the economy below the inflation target. Now, that's something they're concerned about, right? So, I think there is a debate about is 2 to 3% the right inflation target. I think we could have a debate, but the RBA is going to be worried that if we have the cash rate above the neutral rate and we have higher interest rates than otherwise, that's going to slow down the economy too much. We'll have higher unemployment than we should have, and we'll end up with inflation undershooting their target band. So I think that's what they're probably concerned about.
Yeah, and I think that's a reasonable. I would describe that as not that there is a sort of an interest rate that we can work out with a bunch of people in a room with fancy suits, and I think we are still trying to determine what the correct price is by observing inflation. The problem, as you say, and what you eloquently described there's a lag. Right. So you're constantly making an interest rate decision today to be able to set what that inflation rate is going to be in 3 to 6 to 9 months in the future. And the data you're seeing today to make your decision is like you're looking at data from 3 months ago, from the decision you made 3 months or 9 months ago, perhaps. So, I agree with that. And that often explains why there's a bunch of there's art in this as well as science to try to work out that steering of the Titanic, I think, is the analogy that people would use. By the way, one other jump off from what you were saying before, another just little example for me to old man shout at clouds here, but the Nauru. Nauru is also bunk. That is also a bullshit concept. The non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. And if nothing else, I mean, the last couple of years should be a great example of why we shouldn't take that seriously. This idea of Nauru. The issue is, the position of Nauru is constantly changing. And if it's constantly changing, using it as a constant is not a very helpful process. I mean, I would say we've had low unemployment now with a recession, per capita recession, but that's the only one that matters. Because we've had falling real wages. Now, I don't want falling real wages, but I mean, that's exactly what you would expect to see if you understand the microeconomy of the labor market. Right, if you've got falling real wages, and it was falling real minimum wage in this country, so you would expect to see unemployment go down if standard supply and demand works in the labor market, which spoiler, it does.
Yes,
and so the way the macroeconomists to try and resuscitate their concept of Nauru would say is, oh well, the Nauru has just changed. It used to be 5, now it's 4. If it's moving every time you change your macroeconomic policy, it's a bunk idea, right? Unemployment is determined by microeconomics. And so I don't think that should be a big motivating factor, except for the fact that sometimes, as we said before, macroeconomists are forced to just read tea leaves and read the entrails of dead animals to try and work out the artistic part of the process.
Yeah. We'll have to come back, and we might have to come back, John, and talk a bit more about how the Reserve Bank and also the Federal Reserve and Bank of England, how they set monetary policy, because it is navigating by the stars, which is the R star and the U star. So the R star is the real neutral interest rate or policy rate, cash rate here, bank rate in the UK, and the federal funds rate in the US. And the U star is the Nauru, as we described. And I think your point's a good one. I mean, it just keeps moving, and it tends to track the actual unemployment rate. So back in, I remember when I first started studying this stuff, well, it must be 25 years or even longer now, 25 years ago, the Nauru we thought was, 6% or something, right? Or,
yeah.
You know what I mean? now we wouldn't think it's anything like that. Yeah.
Well, we went to the same university at roughly the same time, and I think I remember the same numbers. So yeah,
it was something like that. Yeah, and I remember in Treasury, I mean, didn't we have at one time we thought the full employment in Australia would be 5%, and then we thought actually it's probably more like 4.5 or maybe 4. So these things keep changing. Yeah,
indeed. Now we had a few different things I wanted to touch off on, but I think some of the topics we were going to talk about anyway perhaps come out of your roundup.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Sorry, go on.
Well, I'm wondering, do you want to reflect? I'm interested in your thoughts on this RBA independence question. I very much believe in RBA independence. My reading of the empirical evidence is that countries are much better off with an independent central bank that's targeting inflation. You just look at historical examples such as Richard Nixon twisting the arm of, I think was it Arthur Burns or one of the Federal Reserve chairmen in the early 70s, where basically Nixon got him to loosen monetary policy to help Nixon get re-elected, and then inflation takes off post-election. So I'm very much a believer in Reserve Bank independence, but now we've got a lot of people I wouldn't expect. People I think are very sound on a lot of issues, starting to question the independence of the Reserve Bank after this decision on Tuesday, which they think is just the RBA living in their ivory tower, the pointy heads who don't understand what's happening out there in the real economy.
I mean, if anything, to me, that's an argument for the independence. That's the exact sort of, they can withstand the populism slightly better than the politicians. Although I got to say, for a triumvirate of reasons, because I am both weird, instinctively libertarian, and fascinated with history, I go a little bit beyond the idea that we have to pick between the monetary policy of the 70s or the 90s. There's also the monetary policy of the 30s and the 1890s, et cetera, et cetera. Look, if the choice is just the sort of pop Keynesian of the 70s and the sort of renewed monetarism of the 90s, then I'll take the monetarism. I'll take the Reserve Bank independence.
Yeah,
and the inflation targeting. I mean, this is the stuff that you and I, as I said before, we went to the university the same university at around the same time. We probably were learning from the same lecturers. We probably imbibed the same lessons, and I still think they are true within the parameters we were given. That the Reserve Bank independence and inflation targeting was a step forward over the system we had in the 70s. Because in the 70s, monetary policy was being set to try and achieve a bunch of things that it could not achieve. And it went chasing shadows, did not catch the shadows because it can't, right? Monetary policy can't change productivity levels. Monetary policy can't change long-term wage levels or long-term unemployment even. So it can't chase that, but it can, when used and abused, create runaway inflation. And so that's what we started to see with this policy of the 60s and 70s, heavily influenced by sort of political pressure instead of hard-headed monetarism. And then we had the sort of ideological revolution in the 70s and 80s, which then got kicked into policy in the 80s and 90s. And from that, we've seen much lower and stable inflation, generally speaking. And I think, I think all of that's true. My only caveat to that is I think there is potentially other options besides those two. And that's basically, I know this will sound, sounds a little bit kooky and weird to everyone who had our sort of education. It sounded kooky and weird to me for a long time. But, another one of those old man shakes fist at clouds and says, where's our gold standard? But I think there is a case to be made for, I also think it'd be, and this one's getting a little bit far away from what we'd normally talk about, but competitive currencies. I think ultimately you're talking about what discipline do you have on your money creator so that your money creator doesn't fall for the time-honored incentive, and they all have it, the time-honored incentive of just creating more money and sort of pocketing the difference. It costs you 1 cent to print a $100 note. You make $99.99 profit every time you print that $100 note. Your incentive is huge to print them. What do you have as a counterbalancing incentive to stop people doing it? By the way, the first person to ever put out fiat currency was Genghis Khan about 1,000 years ago in the Yuan dynasty. It might not have been Genghis, but the dynasty started by Genghis Khan, the Yuan dynasty. And it exactly happened as it's happened nearly everywhere in history. You introduce it, the first guy's responsible, the second guy less so, the third guy prints too much, runaway inflation, they go back to a hard currency. I don't know if we've had enough time to let that experiment play out in the current situation in our current dynasty that we're in. So the first incentive you've got under the Keynesian system is, just trust me, bro, or trust politicians because they never have any incentive to get reelected. They're only wise and benevolent. And of course, that's obviously utter bullshit, which is why that sort of system of political decisions about when you just, print excess money, the printer goes brr, as the meme says. That one tends not to work. So now we've got let a bunch of boffins do it. And I got to say that I think will tend to lead to lower inflation. I think there are inherent risks to that as well, which is probably a broader, bigger political issue of to what degree do we want to just let very smart people in an office somewhere be making massive decisions for everyone else when they are then becoming an ultimate authority, which I suspect is what a lot of the pushback you're getting now is against the independent RBA. They're saying these bureaucrats have too much power. And yes, we don't elect those bureaucrats. And I think writ large, it is true that bureaucrats in the Western world have far too much power. I think that is a true comment. Although I do think in this instance, the Reserve Bank bureaucrats do a better job than the Reserve Bank politicians. But there is another option, and that is the only discipline, in my opinion, that has ever worked on powerful people. And that is the threat of them losing their business or the threat of them losing their customers, competition. So I mean, this is a kind of a fringe Austrian economics libertarian position, but the idea of competitive currencies, you print too much of your currency, people will shift to another one, which would require that the government doesn't charge capital gains tax on or all other currencies other than the currencies they approve of. So no capital gains tax on gold, no capital gains tax on Bitcoin. This is a very big conversation, but
well, maybe we should come back to it.
There's four options to
that's a good point you make about the capital gains. You can't, if it's a currency, if you want it to be a currency, you can't charge capital gains on it. I think that's a good point.
And the other one is whether you can pay your tax in it, because that's if you have to pay your tax in the Australian dollar, then the Australian dollar is effectively being propped up by our system. Even if it's not required, it's functionally required because you have to convert your other currency, Australian dollar, to pay tax. But anyway,
exactly. John, is there a tie in between what you were saying and what one of our viewers is saying in the question? Is it Gardo? What does it say about our economy that a lot of us are waiting for RBA decisions? I think what it says about our economy is a lot of us have huge mortgage debt, doesn't it? I think that's what it says.
Yeah. And look, a lot of my libertarian friends do make the point, which is, it's partly true, but I'm going to do something here. I've probably just pissed off a bunch of the non-libertarian audience by talking about something crazy like competitive currencies. And now I'll turn around and piss off the libertarian audience. So I've got no friends by the end of this session, which is, they make the case, which is true, that the RBA setting the interest rate is price fixing. Right. And nearly every other situation, we know that price fixing tends to create distortions and worries. The price is set too high, the price is set too low, you have shortages, you have excess. And so they say this is just, price setting, but it's the biggest example of price setting we have. Now, I don't like the status quo, but here's my pushback against my libertarian friends there is, there is going to be some provider of that currency, and they're going to have to make a decision of either setting or influencing the interest rate on the loanable funds traded in that currency, or just deciding how much of that currency to put out, right? Just setting your M0, like how much to literally print.
Yeah.
So to some degree, it's an unavoidable problem that someone has to face. Now, I then go back and join the libertarian side of this and say, look, it should be made by a bunch of competing money providers, and that competition is what will keep them honest. But I think we have to admit that this is a network good, right? There's going to be network externalities, i.e., most people are going to want to use the currency that all of their neighbors are using, right? If everybody in your town is using Aussie dollars and you walk in there and try to buy something with New Zealand dollars, if no one's accepting it, then it doesn't work, right? You're going to give up quickly and switch to Aussie dollars, right? So there's a network externality. It's like the same sort of situation of which social media to use, right? If everybody was on Facebook and then everyone switched to Instagram and you're the only person left on Facebook, yeah, to some degree you have choice, but of course it only works if you go to where everyone is, right? So there is going to be some amount of monopoly power to whoever provides the currency. And whoever that is, whether public or private, whether a politician or a bureaucrat, they are going to have to make a very difficult decision how much more money to put out that year, unless you switch back to a commodity, right? Gold, silver, there's something to be said for that as well, right? That takes the decision out of everyone's hands. But there is always going to have to be this decision point about how much base money is put out there. So it is it's a tricky question. It's a tricky thing to try and answer, whoever answers it, whether it's a politician, a bureaucrat, or a businessman. I have more faith in a businessman under a competitive environment, but it is just a tricky, and all three of those will end up making some amount of mistakes over time.
Yeah.
Anyway,
good points, John. Good points.
We've got a lot. We've drifted a bit further away from what the topic I thought we were going to have. How about I take it back for a moment?
Everything is connected, so it's all good.
That's very zen. How about then we jump to anyone listening at home? Help us out with this. We need a name for this segment. At the moment, I'm just calling it Gene's Roundup. The Gene's Roundup of economic data for the week. That's the name.
I was going to talk about the RBA interest rate decision. We just did it. So
I thought you wanted to.
All those charts relate to the RBA interest rate decision, but I essentially we had that conversation. You asked questions and I just gave you my answer without referring to the chart. So we could do that. We'll do it next week. I'll make sure I bring the charts up when they need to come up. But we've essentially dealt with all the points I wanted to make anyway.
All right. Was there anything fun in here? So this is Australia's. That's multiple countries, is it?
Yeah, they're all the different policy interest rates for different countries. I mean, basically show we're remaining flat. We're lower than I think that shows we're lower than UK and US still, but New Zealand has really cut its policy interest rate down to what is it? Must be near just above 3%. Now, I think it increased its rates higher than ours, got inflation under control, but a lot more quickly. But also, they had a bit of economic pain associated with that. But now they're reaping the benefits of it and being able to reduce that cash rate of theirs. But yeah, John, I think we should move on. I think I've basically covered all of those points.
And this is your CPI coming down into the 2 to 3 range.
Basically that's the difference between the monthly and the quarterly rates. The quarterly rate is still up around 3% or 2.9. We need to see whether that does come down to where the monthly rate is at 2.4. That's the trimmed mean. That's the core inflation measure. I was just showing that the market was surprised by the cash rate staying constant, and the dollar got a little bit of a bump from that.
Now, this is an interesting one because I think the Aussie dollar, I mean, this would be Aussie to US, is it? Oh, no, this is, you got both.
I've got China and US there. So US is on the right axis.
And we've got that April dip, which I imagine was Trump's announcement of tariffs.
Yeah, that was actually, wasn't it? Yeah,
Because
we got.
which makes
Yeah,
perfect sense. If there's a big tariff regime that America's putting on Australia, you'd expect to see the American dollar spike upwards and our spike downwards. Uh, and the fact that our dollar seems to be doing quite comfortably since then indicates to me that the market does not expect to get hit very hard by Trump's tariffs.
yeah, I think
At least
that's
right
right.
now.
Well, it's part of there's that view forming, the taco view, the Trump always chickens out. So I think that's the. Yeah, have you heard that?
I'd heard that once
So,
before, but yes, okay.
I mean, Trump talks tough, and part of it's bluster, part of it's the negotiating position, the art of the deal, and then when he saw the bond market, having a conniption or whatever, the getting yippy, was that his term? He decided to pause the tariffs. Yeah.
And then this is our beloved Nauru, the
Yeah. I
unemployment
just
rate.
thought I'd bring that up because I think that's one of the things that the RBA is still concerned about, because they're seeing, well, hang on, the unemployment rate's remaining low, and if we think our Nauru, and I know we had that discussion about whether that makes any sense or not, if we think that's around 4.5, then maybe 4 is still a low unemployment rate. It's not, and
Yeah.
maybe we should keep the interest rates. We should be cautious about cutting them too much.
Well, what they need to look for is whether what happens with wages, right? I mean, this
Yeah,
low unemployment's been in a world of basically negative real wage growth. So if we
yeah,
start to get positive real wage growth, then
yeah.
that might change how you interpret that one. And that's your last
And I,
graph.
yeah, and I think, I mean, the low wages growth is partly, I mean, there's the productivity angle. There's also just the massive labor supply shock from immigration. Okay, I mean, that's got to be part of the story. I'd say, in terms of what's keeping wages growth low. But I mean, maybe that's a topic for another episode.
Yeah, although that was primarily the cause, you wouldn't expect it to see a downward pressure on unemployment. So the downward pressure on unemployment, I mean, they did, I think, freeze the minimum wage one year, and I'm not sure if they fully have unwound that freezing. So I suspect we're just seeing some leftover benefits from the fact that they froze the minimum wage one year. And
Mm.
I suspect they're going to unwind that slowly over time, saying, "Look, we have to unwind this now because we're in better days." And when they unwind it, you'll see the unemployment rate start to tick back up, and then everyone will pretend, "Oh, Nauru works all along." All right. Badly. So a segue then on the RBA, if you will. The Deputy Governor gave a speech to the Economic Society of Australia's conference, the Australian Conference of Economists. So
Yes.
he gave a talk and he outlined. So I've got a question for you at the end of this. I'm
Yep.
not sure if you saw my
Okay.
message to you, giving you 5 minutes
Yep.
warning of this question. But
Yep.
so they outlined the three big challenges facing Australia, the Australian economy at the moment, and the slowdown in productivity was one of them. And the second one was sort of geopolitics and the tariff situation, especially with Trump being quite unpredictable. And the third one was climate change. And I got to say, I look at the three of those. I think productivity, absolutely, yes, that's the big shining star, the bright neon flashing light. Um, Trump's tariffs or the geopolitics, sure, you could include that. I mean, it's going to be relevant. I wouldn't include it in my top three, but I don't think it's silly. And then climate change, I just think it's a stupid thing to include, unless you mean the stupid overreaction of politicians to climate change. But I don't think that's what he meant. So that was his three, but it got me thinking. It got me thinking about what my three would be. And I've got three penciled in, but before I say anything else, Gene, what would your three be? You're the Deputy Governor of the RBA. Congratulations on your promotion.
Oh, thank
You're
you.
giving a
Yes.
speech to the ESA. What are the three economic challenges that Australia has to somehow navigate?
Well, I would say, I think the lack of productivity growth, the malaise related to that, I think, is the excessive growth of social services, the challenge of restraining or keeping the NDIS to a reasonable rate of growth. I mean, they're targeting an 8% rate of growth, which is still just much faster than all other government expenditure, much faster than nominal GDP growing, say, at 5%. So they're basically just committing to the NDIS ever expanding in real terms. So I think they're all related. I think that's one issue. I would say the challenge of providing affordable housing for people. I think we've really just failed younger generations. I mean, and that doesn't just mean Gen Zs. That means millennials and some Gen Xs, right? I think we've failed them in terms of having affordable housing. And there's a lot of issues there. There's supply side restrictions. There's also the fact that the federal government completely lost control of immigration coming out of COVID, 550,000 in 1 year, which is just insane. I mean, should never have happened. Complete dereliction of their duty. And that was both, that's not necessarily this current government. That I think that's the previous government too. I think it must bear some responsibility. So there's that. And then finally, I would say, I agree with you about the overreaction. I think the high cost of energy, which is threatening some of our traditional industries, and now we're talking bailouts. The government's going to have to subsidise a lot of these smelters to keep them open because of policies that are misdirected, misguided, in my view, in the absence of an international agreement, a real international agreement that's going to force China, that's going to force India, that's going to force the United States, the European Union to take proper measures to reduce emissions. I can't see any real benefit in us going alone in the absence of any firm international agreement. So they would be mine. I'd also throw in another, but it may not be economic. I think social harmony is a huge issue at the moment. Peter Curti at CIS, so big shout out to Peter. I think he's doing some great work on how do we have a core belief now in Australia that unites us when we're no longer a society with that comes from the same cultural background. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that was that was the best thing for us. I mean, I think we need to embrace. I think with other cultures, it's good to have a mix in the community. And I mean, we want to be a welcoming country, but the challenge now is how do we do that? How do we live together? How do we not fight each other over conflicts in other parts of the world? So I think that's a huge challenge for us as well.
Yeah, no, point taken. I think I almost included that last one, and then I chickened out and picked more economic. Although my third one is going to sound not very economic as well, but when I get to it. But just picking up on one of the things you said there about the climate change and the climate change, lack of an international climate change agreement. Now, I hesitate to give advice to people who I disagree with, and I think the whole thing should just there shouldn't be a climate change policy. I don't think it passes a benefit cost test. And I note, by the way, that this is a segue on my own segue, so I apologize in advance for this. But for people passing climate policy, I'd encourage them to this. When you put down the climate policy, it should be required to indicate how much you expect this climate policy to change temperatures. Mm-hmm. Because I think if they actually wrote down the benefit, I mean, they're doing a benefit cost test, and the benefit is some vague, we're going to save the universe, look at Greta Thunberg, and then, there'll be no cost, we can just do it with taxpayers' money and that's free. The benefit cost analysis being done here is atrociously, it's just non-existent, right? They don't do it because they know what the answer will be. But let's get a little bit closer, right? The benefit is presumably less climate change. How much less? Write it down. Mm. Right? Make all the mainstream assumptions. I don't mean go and get Ian Plimer to do the assumptions. God bless him. He may well be right. But take the IPCC estimates and tell us, all right, we're all paying more for energy. We're being told we can't drive these cars, or we have to shut down this industry, and you can't have too many cows. All right, so there are costs. What's the benefit? Write it down. And they won't write it down because they know the honest answer is that these policies, which do hurt people, the benefit will be it slows down warming by about 3 hours by the year 2100. Or their temperatures might change by 0.001 degree or some ridiculously unnoticeable thing. And so if they admitted that. But anyway, let's put that aside. So I think the whole thing is nearly all climate policy is bad policy, in my opinion. Having said that, now I don't want to give them advice they might take, but it seems to me self-evident that if you were as scared as they say they are, the correct policy is not for Australia to act unilaterally or act before the curve. The correct policy would be to pass legislation today locking us in to make all of these changes if and only if X number of foreign countries do it. This does two things. It binds us to do our fair share of an international agreement if it ever happens. We lock it in early. But it actually increases the incentive for India and China and Indonesia and the rest of the world to actually do so, right? Because we won't hamstring ourselves unless they hamstring them. We lock it into legislation. The whole thing can only be addressed if you get India, America, China, and Indonesia, Brazil on board.
Yes.
So the only policy that matters is how do you get them on board? And the only thing we can do there is to have an if-then piece of legislation. And so that's what seems self-evident to me, that that's what you do if you are honestly scared and trying to fix the problem. That's what you do. So we'll see if anyone actually does that. I suspect that they're not doing that because that's not what they're really motivated by, but we will see. Anyway.
Oh, everyone's terrified. I mean, people are legitimately worried about it, John. So they think we've just got to take emergency measures now. And so look, I understand where they're coming from. I don't share that view myself, but I think I can see why they come to the conclusions that they do. I mean, even if
policy
they think irrationally. But they're not. I don't think people are having an emotional reaction to it, or they're scared, they're worried about it. They're rather than thinking like the cool-headed, rational, calculating economist that we are. So I think that's the difference.
I agree to some degree. I think a lot of the voters are making an emotional decision. That's just true across the board. Voters, let's be honest, the vast majority of voters don't sit down and do an economic PhD to study the economic policy and a sociology PhD and a health PhD and they dissect in depth all of the consequences of all the policy. That's not how anyone votes. We all know it. People vote on the basis of a vibe, right? So yes, I grant you that a lot of voters are just basing it off the vague fear campaign they remember from school. But the policy makers, why aren't the policy makers suggesting a if then? They've got to know, right? They've got to be aware that just blind emotionalism and emoting and overreacting isn't a proper policy setting. Everywhere else, they do a benefit cost analysis. Why aren't these hard-headed bureaucrats that can, be very meticulous when they need to be? Why do they suddenly forget that now? So I agree with you. A lot of people sitting at home, like the people reacting like shrieking teenage girls running around, my hair's on fire, my hair's on fire. I agree. They're acting emotionally. But I don't think that gets the bureaucrats and the heavy hitter boffins in Canberra off the hook. They would either do an if then, or they're motivated by something else. That's the options I can see.
I guess they work for the government of the day. I remember, I mean, it turned
other way around, Gene. Other way around.
The
government of the day works for them. I think the government of the day works for the bureaucrats, but that's a different topic.
Okay, yeah. But I remember how, like, up until that Al Gore film, the Australian government position was that adaptation made most sense, right? The costs of mitigating, maybe you do a few things that were easy, that were low-hanging fruit. I mean, the whole land, some measures regarding land clearing, but otherwise it was going to be too costly. We're better off just adapting. But then that Al Gore film came out, what was it? The Uncomfortable, Inconvenient Truth. And everyone just freaked out. And we're having the G20 film, not the G20 film, the G20 finance ministers meeting in Australia in 2007. And so there was pressure then to have climate change on the agenda. And John Howard even set up the commission to look into an emissions trading scheme. Peter Shergold and then Martin Parkinson went to work on that, and then we had Rudd come in. So things changed very quickly. It was extraordinary. I think a lot of it was that film. A lot of it was this emotional reaction. Yep. Anyway, we should probably talk about Tobin tax. Go ahead.
Having taken a deviation, then a deviation on the deviation, allow you to give me my three.
Yes.
Okay. So two of them are the same as yours, right? I did have them already written down before you, but two of them. So one, productivity, right? So you, me, the RBA, we all agree that if that's not fixed, we are in for serious problems in the coming decades. And we're not on track to fix it. So you should be worried. And I put housing down as a second one because I think that is like a legitimate big neon sign flashing issue that we should be. And then my third one, I played around with a few different options, but stick with me here. Fertility. The fertility rate.
Okay.
So
sure.
it sounds like a weird one, but I think I've said this to a few people. I think this is true. When people look back at the history of time long gone, they don't remember every nuance of every detail. They won't remember every single one of our live streams, Gene, much to their eternal shame. You remember a few things, right? So if you remember the 11th century, what was that? Oh, the Norman conquest of England, right? The 5th century, the fall of the Roman Empire. There's only a few things you remember. And I think when the 21st century is remembered, people go, 21st century, that was the year where population started collapsing, right? I think we're not going to be remembered for terrorism or climate change. They seem very big to us now, but we will be remembered for that's when the population of the world started imploding.
It
could, World War III.
Or moderating. I mean, falling from, it's going to get up to 10 billion, isn't it? Or something around 10 billion, and then it's going to start declining. But then, I mean, who's to say where it ultimately ends up? I mean, we don't know what future fertility trends are, although perhaps it is going to remain below replacement rate in advanced economies. Perhaps that is a well-established economic and demographic phenomenon. I don't know.
I think something will change, but that something is going to be such a big change because the ultimate solution to this is that a lot of traits we have, a lot of our political and religious traits are genetic, right? And if that's true, and it is true, then the future belongs to whoever has kids, right? So there's going to be a natural solution, which is the sort of people who hold philosophies and religions and political views that are associated with low fertility. Those views will die out. That's why, woke has a built-in, suicide pill built into it. Woke people just don't have kids. So that mindset will die out. That's going to take a while. This is going to take generations. And who comes out the other end could look like a very different group of people with different philosophical, political, and religious beliefs to what we understand today. So that change is still going to be monumental, right? So also, we might not even make 10 billion now because all the demographers are still underestimating the collapse in fertility. Fertility is down to 1.5 in Australia now. You need about 2.1 or 2.05 to sustain your population long term. I've got a little graph here, and this has only just started showing up this has long lags. We talked about the RBA, 3, 6, 9 month lags. We're talking about 30, 40, 50, 60 year lags for when this kicks in. But once it kicks in, it seems almost unsolvable by policy. But here's just one little example of what we're looking at here. This is the natural growth in population in Australia, and you can see it was pretty consistent for 120 and then got up to about 140 and then for a bit 160. And now we're down around the 100 mark. And it's only just started kicking in for us, right? So this trend is going to snowball, right? It's going to become a bigger and bigger change going forward. And we've started to see some discussion about some of the consequences. To his credit, Peter Costello brought in the intergenerational report, released supposed to be every 5 years, to tell us how the aging population is going to impact on public finance. And so we've been kind of looking at this issue of an aging population for 20 years. And every time we look at it, the conclusion, I think, if people are honest, the conclusion is terrifying. We can't afford. So your point before about the runaway social spending, look, to some degree, I have no inherent problem with the idea of social spending, ensuring that people can get help and better healthcare and all that sort of stuff, cheaper healthcare. But the way it's done can destroy countries.
Yeah. John, I just want to... Yeah, I just wanted to ask, though, I mean, I don't have a problem with the assistance, with the help. I think you'd share the same concern that sometimes there's a bit of learned helplessness. I mean, sometimes the assistance can actually be damaging to people's ability to look after themselves. So I think that is one of the concerns with some of the assistance, and we're crowding out the private provision of help. We're crowding out, people actually looking after their own family members, or I know that we want to make sure people aren't burdened, and so it is good to have some support. But I just worry in some cases that we're actually reducing the ability of people to rely on their own resources. But sorry, that was an interruption. I should have let you continue.
No, I fully agree, and perhaps we can come back and actually do a whole segment on social policy. When I said I'm all for the idea of there being some sort of assistance, I didn't preface that with saying government assistance, right? So I'm just saying in general, I'm not saying I don't want poor people to be helped. But then the issue is, I think this is a segue again, a very broad brush comment, and we can maybe come back and do it properly later. I think the help only is a net benefit long term if the help is coming from someone who kind of has a buy-in on the future of that person you're helping, not a bureaucrat who's a stranger who stamps a check and doesn't know your name, but someone who actually has a buy-in on what's good for you. In that way, when you genuinely need help, they're going, yes, I have a buy-in. I care about your outcome. You genuinely need help. Of course, that's the time for everyone to tick the box or sign the form or whatever. But when you see someone rorting the system, they're rorting it. Other people that deserve it get less. You see that, and you're incentivized then to cut them off. So, but anyway, this is a much bigger topic on the different way you frame how to help people. I was just starting it by saying this isn't about not helping people. This is about setting the incentives for helping people in a way that actually works. But the other problem we have of our current system is it's just unsustainable because of the aging population. Fewer kids, the people who are alive today are living for longer. So the more and more people are over retirement age, and the ratio of that, working age to retired used to be 5.5 to 1. Now it's 3.5. It's heading down to under 2 workers per one retiree. It's just unsustainable. But that's just the start of this process, because you get the aging population, and then a decade or two after that, you start to get the shrinking population. And that's going to exacerbate everything. And I don't think many people have even started thinking about the consequences of this yet. A lot of the systems we currently rely on, a lot of the ways our economies work and function, kind of presuppose that there is just a growing pie, like asset prices go up. Right, they might go up, too slow or too fast sometimes, and different assets will go up at different speeds, and some assets will collapse. But as a general background assumption of our model, asset prices go up. That's not true in a shrinking population. Now, that's fine if you can continue investing in other countries that are growing. This is a worldwide phenomenon. I didn't mean to say the 21st century will be known for when Europe dies off. Latin America, under replacement rate. China, under half. Korea, under half. Japan, under half. Right? Each generation is going to be half the size of the previous generation. That's insane, right? Southeast Asia, gone. India, below replacement rate. The Middle East, slightly above, but trending down. They'll probably go below replacement rate, before well, I don't know when, but in the near future. This is something to behold, and I think it's such a slow burn that people are going to be able to ignore it until basically it's too late to do anything about it. But if I had to pick 3 things for people to focus on, I think we should start keeping half an eye on, or more than half an eye on, fertility rate and what to do about it.
Yeah, so. But John, I'd say, I think that's actually a really quite a profound observation, really. I hadn't thought of it like that. If you think about the broad sweep of history and what people will remember, you may well be right. I mean, because if the population peaks at 10 billion and then starts declining, then yeah, absolutely, that's huge news. What I would argue, not argue, but I'm wondering, I mean, may there not be benefits from it though? Because if we're concerned about so-called planetary limits, impacts on ecosystems, if we're concerned about, what about the issue of emerging economies, the developing economies? A reduction in population growth may well help some of them. I mean, if you look at some countries with, basically too many people, not enough land, right? That's the classic problem of economic development in some, in many sort of developed economies. This
You'd be talking about the notoriously poor places like Hong Kong and Singapore that, of course, remain notoriously poor because they don't have much land to population.
But I mean places like many parts of India, Indonesia in parts, right? This might actually be beneficial.
I don't see, through development economics, I don't see any proper correlation between land size and development, between even the number of resources you have and development.
Yeah.
It's institutions that I think determine the quality of your development.
Okay.
So I don't think that. Look, there are things though. Some pressures on the environment will soften. There are, though, some environmental problems that can only be solved through innovation. And as you get a shrinking population and more of that population is aged over 70, you're going to have less innovation, right? So there's going to be environmental pluses and minuses, but I grant you that there are going to be people who benefit from a shrinking population, just as there are people who lose and benefit from nearly every change in life. But I think if we add up the totality of the changes, it's going to be massive, right? It's going to be massive, and for some people, in some countries, it's going to be disastrous. And like a question here from Gordo coming in: will our population actually shrink if we keep immigration levels high? The immigration can slow that down somewhat. It can't really fix it for two reasons. One is, if you're talking about the aging of the population, spoiler, immigrants also get old, right? So then it can only work to keep down the age pyramid if you have like this never-ending Ponzi scheme of ever-increasing immigration, which I don't think is a sustainable model long-term. But some amount of moderate immigration can slow down the process of the population imploding. But then that raises the question of, and I think this is the part that people aren't really getting. I'm not talking about Australian decline or European decline. Yeah. This is Earth, right? So where are we going to get these immigrants from? And right now, we could do this. Australia is a very desirable place to live. We will be able for decades in the future, while other countries are facing this problem head on and can't solve it, we'll be able to like cheat for a little bit longer because we're a very desirable country to live. And so we will get more than our fair share of immigrants if we want them. But that's not a long-term fix if everywhere, basically, except for Nigeria and Chad and Sudan, if everywhere else in the world is got below replacement fertility, just the question is,
what
where do we
about
get
won't Elon Musk solve this for us, John, with all of the robot technology and AI? I mean, that's certainly going to be part of the story, right? I mean, we've got to. I mean, how many decades? It can't be that many decades away now that we will have service robots. I mean, it may. I mean, I guess you see prototypes now. I mean, the technology's just remarkable that we're seeing. I mean, clearly it needs to be perfected and made economic. I mean, maybe it's not economic to roll out yet, but I think that's potentially part of the response, part of the solution.
It's going to be part of the economic changes for sure, but then the issue is who owns those robots? Right? I mean, if the robots is what's doing everything that's productive, then whoever owns the robots owns. So I imagine GDP will keep going up even as a declining population because of technology if we have robots. So you'll have this massive GDP all owned by the people who own the robots. And then, what do all the 70-year-olds do?
Well, John, this is why we'll end up. I mean, seriously, maybe we should talk about this in another episode, but won't we have a movement then to nationalize the robots? Won't the robots be the means of production? And that the masses will want to seize control of them because there's this vision, this left-wing vision, the Aaron Bastani, isn't it? Is it Aaron Bastani, the fully automated luxury communism? Have you heard of that? You know what I'm talking about? So that's the idea. We'll nationalize all the robots. So, I mean, that's what you'll see.
I don't know that name, but it's I've just, in my mind, I picture, because you were saying seize the means of production, and I was picturing this sort of army of 70 and 80-year-olds with pitchforks sort of coming in. Because the other issue you're going to have here is different countries are going to have this at different rates. And you're going to get some countries, like Korea has about 40 million people now, right? So this one I think really brings it home. Korea has about 40 million people in 3 generations. And you have to wait for the generations to play out, right? So we're talking over 100 years here. But still, in 3 generations' time, they'll go from 40 million people down to about 4 million people. Less than 4. I think it's about 2 million, actually, so I've exaggerated it. So from 40 million down to 2 million. They'll have 2 million people left, most of whom will be retirement age. How are they not losing to North Korea at that point? So those 1 million 80-year-olds can go with pitchforks walking down the empty streets of Seoul saying we want to nationalize the robots. But what are they doing with the countries around them that haven't hit that degree of population decline at that point? It's going to get messy, right? I just think it's going to get much messier than people have factored in yet. And I think at the moment, it's a very superficial conversation about this. And my conversation about it's still superficial because I just think we've only just started scratching the surface. But I would put, if there's 3 things to pick, I think that'll be one of the big ones. Look, we're coming up to an hour and...
We haven't talked about the Tobin tax, John.
We haven't yet. I don't know if you can stick around for 5 or 10 and I'll fly through
I
some
can,
extra
yeah, but I
thoughts
got
on
to
it.
hop off at 8:45. I push back my call tonight, 8:45.
Okay, you're a good man. All right. So Lyndon here, future topic, Argentina and Malay. I think Millie. I think it's Malay, but Millie's a good name too. But yeah, Argentina seems to be doing well. God bless them. It's going to be a really good experiment as to how the other half of Argentina pushes back. Like, are they going to let this keep going? But I'm not holding my breath. I'm hopeful. It's good to have hope, but the story hasn't finished playing out yet. So, but yeah, maybe we should touch on that. Let's invite John Ruddock on to talk about it. He's always across this. He's mentioning Malay in the New South Wales Parliament every chance he gets. So he's across it. So, change of speed. Tobin tax. It was brought up a few times. We touched on it last week. We both gave a few comments. I thought about it a little bit more since then, and I think to a large degree, I'm happy to rest on many of those comments, but there's a few other things that I think are worthwhile pointing out. One is I did a bit more of a look into it. I've looked into Tobin before, then it was brought up on the spot, so I didn't have my research quick to hand. I went back and found my old thoughts and some good papers on it. And the point I made before about a low level of this tax having fairly small economic impacts is probably true. And then if you put it too high, you would really start screwing things up. But that's basically true of all taxes. And then I made the case that the issue is once it's there, you've got the political risk that they just keep pushing it up beyond the level where it makes sense efficiency-wise anymore. There is, of course, with the Tobin tax, and this is an obvious point that both of us probably should have mentioned last week, but for a Tobin tax to work, it needs to be international. Right? So they're looking. I mentioned before that my concern about it was a political economy concern, right? You put in a 0.01% Tobin tax and the efficiency cost is probably pretty small and we could live with it if we cut other taxes and that's all great. And I said, my concern is more political economy. They'll keep pushing it up. What I should have said is my concern is still political economy, but it can only really be coordinated at an international level. So this would need to be a UN tax.
So just for clarity,
this opens up,
this is a tax on all financial transactions, isn't it? Is that right? You're interpreting Tobin tax like that?
Yeah, well, it's money exchanges, right?
Money
so
exchanges,
international transactions.
Yes. International transactions, right. Yeah, correct. Yep. Go ahead. Sorry.
Which is going to be extremely easy to evade unless it's done in a uniform way worldwide, right? So if it's not done in a uniform way, it's going to be not ridiculous. It's going to be easy enough to evade, and there's enough money on the line and enough very financially astute people with money to lose, they will just evade the tax. And so then that'll turn into, well, to make our Tobin tax work, we need to have it uniform and we need to have it uniformly enforced. Well, who on earth can, so that sounds like I'm saying who on earth can do it. I'm meaning who literally on the planet Earth is able to uniformly enforce a tax? We're talking about the UN, right? So I don't know if people think it's someone else. I'd like to hear who it is. The WHO, perhaps. We have a lot of faith in them. Maybe the IPCC. But whoever it is, some international body, the WEF. All of the above, for my mind, is not an acceptable answer, right? So my concern to that is just, we go back to, I think last week we were talking about the competition between jurisdictions. To my mind, it's the only thing that long-term keeps politicians in check. You said you hope democracy works as well. I don't share your optimism, but I guess that's another one that could happen. But I think the only thing long-term that keeps government in check is that the ability of people to move into different jurisdictions. So one world government is the epitome of everything I fear most, right? I would happily sign up to a decentralized system of 200 socialist countries over a one world libertarian utopia, because that one world government will descend into tyranny, I think, axiomatically, right? I see no way that doesn't happen because there is nowhere to escape. And those 200 decentralized countries will eventually, through trial and error, discover that socialism doesn't work. So one world government is, I think, everyone thinks it's pie in the sky and it's a conspiracy theory kook stuff. I don't think many people are trying to do it at this point. But a policy that requires it, I think, is not a policy that I am keen to see presented and pushed much further at this point. Another quick point to note, well, I did mention last week when we touched on it, that yes, it's a tax on, effectively a Tobin tax is such a low percentage tax that it is a tax on trade and foreign investment, but it's a rounding error, right? It really doesn't discourage much trade or foreign investment if it's a low enough level. What it does discourage is those speculations where you're sending money back and forth multiple times an hour or multiple times a day, the day trading. Right. And people think, oh, well, it's only hitting day traders. It's only hitting speculators. That doesn't really hurt. As I said before, speculation does something. It's price discovery. Right. I mean, a lot of that stuff is arbitrage opportunities. You think, well, why do you get paid for arbitrage? You're not doing anything good in the world. That's the only way you actually have prices that are indicating the value of things, right?
Yeah.
Prices are often wrong. What arbitrages do is they come in and get those prices to accurately reflect reality so that everyone else, when we respond to prices, we actually are doing something that makes sense in the world. But having said that, look, all tax is going to discourage something. If you discourage a little bit of speculation, not the end of the world if the tax was low enough. My bigger concern is that it has to be globally coordinated. And the other thing to note is it may still be quite easy to avoid. Like, it's not a potential solution there would just be to set up derivative products inside a country, not require any financial transaction, and still be able to bet on the outcomes. Yeah. And so you may just see this massive shift into derivatives, and then we've got this constant whack-a-mole situation of trying to chase traders through different sorts of derivatives. So I don't think it'll work, and I think it can only be done in a way that I am deeply scared of, which is too much power in the UN.
Sound analysis, John. I think very good points. I am going to have to wrap up soon because I've got another call, but it's all a great pleasure as always. I think we covered a lot of ground today. Really enjoyed the conversation on climate change, depopulation, what else? Inflation, the Nauru, and lots of topics for the future.
And I didn't even get the chance to ask you about the impact of the Israel-Iran war, which I was going to do if we had time.
Okay, maybe next week. If we get John Ruddock on, then maybe he could offer some insights into that too.
Well, he's a big fan of Malay and the Argentina experiment, so I'd really like to hear from him on that one, as Lyndon said. So I'll put out the request and see if we can get Mr. Ruddock to come and join us sometime soon. But until then, at home, thank you for listening along and joining us tonight. We are back every Thursday. I say every Thursday, most Thursdays, 7:30 p.m. On X, Facebook, and YouTube. At the ATA channel, Australian Taxpayers Alliance, taxpayers.org.au. Go along, check us out, join if you want. And my own channels, right, John Humphreys channels. Whichever ones you're watching, please go along to those other ones. Give us a like, give us a follow so that we know how to stay in touch with you and so that the algorithm boosts what we're doing. Everyone at home, thank you for joining us. Gene, thank you as always. And I will see you next week.
Thanks, John. See you guys.
Ciao.